May 1945, in the shattered, smoldering remnants of Germany. Corporal Jimmy Hayes stood at a dusty military checkpoint and watched a little girl emerge from the ruins. She was perhaps 7 years old, her blonde pigtails frayed and coated in ash, the soles of her shoes worn straight through to the cold, unforgiving ground. She did not utter a single word to the heavily armed American soldier standing before her. She simply stopped, looked up into his eyes with a gaze that had seen far too much, and held out her small, trembling hands. It was the universal, devastatingly silent gesture for absolute starvation. Inside the deep pocket of his olive-drab uniform, Hayes's fingers were tightly wrapped around a single Hershey's chocolate bar. It was a rare luxury he had meticulously saved from his field rations, intending to eat it in the quiet solitude of the night to briefly forget the war. He looked down at the starving girl, then let his gaze drift to the desolate, cratered road behind her. From the deep shadows of collapsed bakeries and shattered homes, a dozen other German children were slowly stepping into the pale daylight. They were all watching him. They were all waiting. Beside Hayes, Sergeant Mike Donovan saw the scene unfolding. The veteran marched over and clamped a heavy calloused hand onto the young corporal's shoulder. Donovan's voice was hard, forged in the brutality of combat. He warned Hayes not to do it, reminding him that while she looked like an innocent kid, she was a German kid, and just yesterday, her father might have been looking through a rifle scope trying to kill American boys. Hayes looked back down at the girl. She had not moved an inch. She remained standing there, infinitely patient, desperately hopeful, and undeniably starving. 20 battle-hardened American soldiers now stood at that checkpoint, the air thick with tension, all watching one low-ranking corporal decide whether to hand a piece of chocolate to a starving enemy child. By that afternoon, the official report of what Jimmy Hayes chose to do would land squarely on the heavy oak desk of General George S. Patton. The legendary commander's response to this single, isolated act would either unleash an unprecedented wave of compassion across the occupied sector or enforce the brutal, unyielding discipline of a conquering army. This is the story of exactly what Patton said, and how a single piece of chocolate redefined the very meaning of victory. The town they were holding was called Kronberg. A few weeks prior, it had been a picturesque settlement, but the merciless machinery of the Allied advance had rolled straight through its cobblestone streets. The heavy fighting had ceased, leaving the structural skeleton of the town mostly intact, but completely eviscerating its lifelines. Germany was in the throes of total systemic collapse. The supply lines were entirely broken, the bridges were blown, and not a single ounce of food was reaching the civilian populations trapped in these isolated pockets. Adding to the misery, the retreating German soldiers, desperate and starving themselves, had stripped the local larders bare before vanishing into the countryside. What remained was a population entirely cut off from the absolute necessities of biological survival. To maintain order and control the chaotic flow of displaced refugees, the American forces had established a series of heavily guarded checkpoints along the main arterial roads. It was standard military doctrine, a cold, logistical necessity designed to prevent insurgency and manage the overwhelming chaos of a defeated state. But doctrine rarely accounts for the human heart. Corporal Jimmy Hayes was 23 years old, a young man whose soul had been forged in the endless, fertile cornfields of Iowa. Before the world caught fire, his greatest anxieties had involved weather patterns and harvest yields. Over the past 8 grueling months in Europe, those innocent concerns had been overwritten by the brutal calculus of infantry combat. He had marched across France and pushed into Germany, losing close friends to invisible snipers and random mortar fire. His mind had slowly started to callous over to protect his sanity from the daily horrors. Yet, despite the unimaginable violence he had witnessed and participated in, the fundamental empathy of a farm boy had not been entirely burned out of him. He still remembered the harsh Midwestern winters of his childhood when his father would carry extra grain to the freezing edges of their property to feed the starving wild deer. His father had taught him a simply unbreakable rule: suffering, regardless of whose it was, demanded a response. History is punctuated by these rare, blinding moments of humanity cutting through the darkness of conflict. Just as British and German soldiers laid down their rifles to play football in no man's land during the Christmas truce of 1914, proving that the shared human experience could momentarily override the mandate to kill, Hayes was about to experience his own profound collision between military duty and fundamental compassion. The morning air at the checkpoint was thick with the smell of pulverized brick and the metallic tang of recent rain. When the little girl approached, her dress, clearly a hand-me-down from an older sister, hung off her skeletal frame like a discarded sack. She walked with the ancient, resigned gait of someone who had watched her world burn to the ground. She didn't speak English, but she didn't need to. Her hollow eyes communicated a desperation that transcended language. Sergeant Donovan, however, viewed the world through a completely different lens. He was 35, a career soldier who had survived the mud of 2 world wars. He was a man composed entirely of sharp edges and rigid doctrine, believing with absolute conviction that sympathy in a war zone was a fatal liability. He tracked Hayes's gaze, saw the girl holding out her hands, and stepped in. He ordered Hayes to step back and look at reality. He told the corporal that he was looking at a German civilian, and the American military was not in the business of feeding German civilians. When Hayes protested that she was starving, Donovan countered with the cold, immovably logic of a conqueror. He stated that a lot of people were starving, and that was the inevitable consequence of a nation deciding to start a global war and losing it. In the deep pocket of his jacket, Hayes felt the silver foil beneath the paper wrapper of his chocolate bar. To him, it was a tiny luxury. To the girl standing before him, it was a lifeline. He wasn't truly hungry. He was adequately nourished by the greatest military supply chain in history. One chocolate bar would not affect his combat readiness. But Donovan, possessing the predatory instincts of a combat veteran, sensed the subtle shift in Hayes's posture. He saw the corporal's hand lingering near his pocket and gripped Hayes's wrist with a strength that bruised the bone. Donovan laid out the terrifying logistical reality. He warned Hayes that if he gave that single piece of candy to that one girl, every single starving child in Kronberg would be standing at that barricade by sunrise tomorrow. He demanded to know if Hayes possessed enough personal rations to feed 3,000 people, because if he started this, he would not be able to finish it. Temporary compassion, Donovan argued, would only breed a chaos that would endanger the entire platoon. Hayes stood paralyzed in the agonizing space between military obedience and human conscience. He looked back at the girl. She had not flinched. Behind her, the gathering of children had swelled. There were now at least 30 of them, ranging from toddlers clinging to the legs of older siblings to teenagers whose faces were prematurely aged by trauma. They formed a silent, spectral audience, emerging cautiously from the side streets. They saw the American uniforms, they saw the weapons, but more importantly, they saw men who were not starving. Where there was an army, there was food. One of the older boys, perhaps 12 years old, summoned the courage to step forward. In broken, heavily accented English, he pleaded for food. Donovan intercepted the plea instantly, stepping in front of Hayes and barking a harsh denial, ordering the children to disperse and return to their homes. The boy did not move. He just stood there, staring. The younger kids behind him started to shuffle nervously. A tiny girl in the back, overwhelmed by the finality of the sergeant's voice and the ache in her stomach, began to weep. It was not a loud, demanding cry, but the weak, defeated whimpering of a body that no longer had the energy to express its despair. That fragile sound shattered the last remnants of military discipline holding Hayes in place. The rigid framework of rules, uniforms, and enemy designations dissolved, leaving only the fundamental reality of a man standing before a crying child while holding a pocket full of food. Defying the crushing grip on his wrist, Hayes pulled his arm free. He drew the Hershey bar from his pocket and held it up into the gray light. The collective intake of breath from the children was audible, a desperate hiss of anticipation. Their eyes locked onto the brown wrapper, as if it were a holy relic. Donovan exploded, his voice cracking like a whip, officially ordering Hayes to stand down, invoking the chain of command, and reminding him of the principle at stake. Donovan shouted that the military feeds its own men, not the enemy. He reminded Hayes of the American boys who had died taking the ground they were standing on. and of the German mothers who had enthusiastically supported the regime that killed them. Donovan demanded that Hayes remember who the enemy was. Hayes did not shout back, but his voice carried a quiet, unbreakable resolve. He looked at the sergeant and asked if the 7-year-old girl with the pigtails had voted for the dictator. He asked if she had built the tanks or started the war. He refused to hold a starving child accountable for the sins of a broken empire. Donovan's face hardened into a mask of pure frustration. He acknowledged her innocence, but stated the brutal reality that her country was guilty, and war does not possess the capacity to care about fairness. The situation at the checkpoint had escalated beyond a simple disagreement. Other soldiers had gathered around, their rifles slung loosely over their shoulders, watching the drama unfold with bated breath. Some averted their eyes, burdened by their own suppressed guilt and wanting Hayes to do it. Others nodded in silent agreement with the sergeant's harsh realism. Recognizing that the situation bordered on mutiny, Donovan dispatched a runner to fetch the commanding officer. This was above his pay grade. Lieutenant Parker arrived minutes later. He was a young officer, barely older than Hayes, thrust into the impossible position of enforcing martial law in a shattered society. He assessed the scene. The defiant corporal, the furious sergeant, and the silent, desperate mob of children. Donovan delivered his report with crisp military precision, framing the incident as a breakdown of order and a direct violation of regulations regarding the distribution of military supplies to non-combatant populations. Parker, acutely aware of his fragile authority and the heavy manuals that dictated his every move, confirmed the sergeant's position. The mandate was clear. Soldiers eat first. Civilians are not the military's responsibility. They must wait for the international relief organizations to arrive. Parker looked at Hayes, demanding a clear acknowledgement of the rules. Hayes felt completely sick to his stomach. He looked at the little girl. She was still there, still holding out her hands, still hoping against hope that the man in the green uniform would save her. Jimmy Hayes made his choice. In a movement of deliberate, agonizing slowness, he unwrapped the chocolate bar. He snapped the brittle chocolate into small, uneven pieces. He stepped past his superior officers, breaking the invisible, sacred barrier of military protocol, and walked directly toward the children. Donovan did not physically stop him this time. He simply watched, his jaw clenched in fury, knowing the young man was throwing his military career away. Hayes knelt in the dirt before the little girl with the pigtails and placed a square of chocolate into her filthy, outstretched hands. The transformation was instantaneous. Her face lit up with an emotion that transcended joy. She took the small piece carefully, as if it were forged of solid gold, placed it in her mouth, and closed her eyes. The restraint of the other children vanished entirely. They surged forward, a desperate wave of small hands and pleading voices pressing in on the young corporal. Hayes distributed the remaining pieces as fast as he could, but the cruel mathematics of the tragedy were inescapable. There were 30 starving kids and only one candy bar. Most of them received absolutely nothing. But what happened next broke Hayes's heart more thoroughly than the starvation itself. The older children who had managed to grasp a tiny fragment of the chocolate did not consume it immediately. With a heartbreaking discipline born of profound collective suffering, they broke their already minuscule pieces in half, placing the crumbs into the mouths of the younger siblings and friends who had missed out. They possessed nothing in the world, yet they retained a savage, beautiful capacity for sacrifice and shared survival. Within seconds, every trace of the chocolate was gone. The children remained clustered around Hayes, their eyes wide, hoping against hope that his pockets contained some endless, magical reserve. He slowly pulled the linings of his pockets inside out, displaying the empty white fabric to the crowd. The disappointment that washed over the children was silent and profound. There were no protests, no anger, no demands. There was only the crushing acceptance of a harsh reality they had learned to expect. Slowly, like a retreating tide, they turned and began the long walk back into the shadows of the ruined town. The little girl with the pigtails was the last to leave. She lingered for a fraction of a second, looking back at Hayes to memorialize his face, before she too faded into the dust. Hayes stood alone in the street, feeling a profound, hollowing emptiness. He had risked a court-martial, crossed the absolute line of insubordination, and in the end, he had barely provided a fleeting moment of relief. Lieutenant Parker approached, his face a mask of administrative grimness. He informed Hayes, with a cold formality, that he had just willfully disobeyed a direct order from a superior officer in a theater of operation. Hayes simply nodded, offering no defense, replying with a quiet "yes, sir." Parker informed him that such an action was a court-martial offense that could result in imprisonment. Again, Hayes simply agreed. Parker looked at the young corporal for a long moment, a flicker of human sympathy battling his officer's conditioning, before sighing deeply. A informed Hayes that he was going to write up the incident and send it up the chain of command to let the brass decide his fate. Until that decision came down, Hayes was confined to his quarters under arrest. The incident report was drafted with clinical, unfeeling detachment. It began its journey upward through the intricate, bureaucratic nervous system of the military hierarchy. It passed from company command to battalion, from battalion to division, carried by couriers and teletype machines across the scarred landscape of Germany. The officers at the intermediate levels, unwilling to make a definitive ruling on an issue so perilously balanced between operational discipline and a potential public relations nightmare, pushed the paper higher and higher. Ultimately, the piece of paper containing the fate of Corporal Jimmy Hayes drifted onto the desk of General George S. Patton. Patton was a man of mythic, terrifying proportions. He was a brilliant, aggressive architect of armored warfare whose name evoked absolute dread in the German high command and nervous awe among his own men. He was notoriously intolerant of cowardice, insubordination, and anything that compromised the lethal efficiency of his advancing armies. He demanded absolute perfection and punished failure with a theatrical wrath. Sitting in his command trailer that afternoon, Patton read Lieutenant Parker's report. He read it a second time, his heavily lined face impassive. A low-ranking corporal had thrown his life away to feed enemy civilians against direct orders. The lieutenant's attached note asked for guidance on whether to proceed with severe discipline to maintain order or to let the infraction slide given the circumstances. Patton leaned back and thought about it deeply. This was not a simple question of a soldier stepping out of line. This was a philosophical crisis. It struck at the very core of what the American Army was supposed to represent in this conquered land. What kind of men did they want to be when the shooting stopped? If they executed their duties with the same unfeeling, mechanical ruthlessness as the Nazi regime they had just spent years trying to destroy, what exactly had they accomplished? He reached for his phone, bypassed his immediate staff, and called the division commander directly. He issued a single, terrifying command. He told them he was coming down there personally and ordered them not to touch the corporal until he arrived. The arrival of General Patton's command convoy in Kronberg the next morning was an event that paralyzed the entire sector. The gleaming jeep rolled to a halt, and Patton stepped out into the dust of the checkpoint like an ancient god of war descending to pass judgment. The soldiers at the barricade stood at rigid attention, terrified of the man's reputation. To make the tension infinitely worse, the children had returned. Word had spread through the cellars and ruins that an American had defied his own people to give out chocolate yesterday. Maybe they would do it again. Today, there were not 30, but 50 starving children, forming a silent, desperate gallery watching the drama unfold. Patton ignored the children initially. He walked straight over to Lieutenant Parker and demanded to see the offending corporal. Hayes was marched forward under guard. He felt a cold sweat tracing his spine. Standing before the legendary general, Hayes felt unimaginably small, fully expecting to be stripped of his rank and sent to a military stockade. Patton looked Hayes up and down, studying him with the intense, predatory scrutiny of an eagle. He cleared his throat and demanded confirmation. He asked Hayes if he had willingly given away his military rations to enemy civilians. Hayes swallowed his fear and answered affirmatively. Patton then demanded to know why. Hayes thought about fabricating a military excuse, but decided that honesty was his only armor. He looked Patton in the eye and stated simply that he did it because they were starving and because they were just children. Patton leaned in closer, his presence overwhelming, and challenged the corporal's naivety. He pointed out the harsh historical truth that those starving children would inevitably grow into German adults who might very well pick up rifles against American soldiers in the next inevitable war. He challenged Hayes to justify arming the future enemy. Hayes had no strategic counter-argument to offer the general. It was a brutal truth. History always repeated itself. Wars always returned. He remained silent, accepting the general's logic but refusing to apologize for his humanity. Patton held the terrifying stare, then turned sharply away from Hayes and faced Lieutenant Parker. He asked for the lieutenant's official recommendation on the matter. Parker, clinging desperately to the safety of the military rulebook, stated his belief that strict discipline was absolutely necessary. If the Army permitted individual soldiers to make independent, emotional decisions about distributing critical rations, the entire logistical framework of the occupation would collapse into absolute chaos. Patton absorbed the lieutenant's rigid assessment and nodded slowly, acknowledging the undeniably tactical truth of the statement. Then, to the absolute astonishment of every single soldier present, the fearsome commander turned his back on his officers and walked deliberately toward the sea of starving children. The kids instinctively recoiled, stepping back in fear. They did not know his rank or his name, but they could sense that this man was different. He radiated a dangerous, immense power. Patton stopped a few feet away from the crowd. Slowly, the older man lowered himself to one knee, bringing his face level with the terrified children. He singled out the closest girl, the very same one with the blonde pigtails from the day before. He did not attempt to speak a word of German. Instead, he reached into the pristine pocket of his tailored uniform jacket and withdrew something. It was another candy bar, a standard military-issue ration. He held it out directly to her. The girl looked at the terrifying general, then at the chocolate, her survival instinct warring with her profound fear. Slowly, she reached out and took the offering. Patton immediately stood up, his demeanor snapping back to that of a supreme commander. He turned to his stunned staff and barked an order to fetch the supply officer. When a terrified major sprinted forward, Patton demanded an immediate, precise inventory of the sector's food reserves. The major informed him that they held ample supplies, enough to sustain the American forces for 2 solid months at their current operational strength. Patton's response shattered the existing protocols of the occupation. He declared that it was good they had excess, and ordered the major to set up a massive civilian distribution point right there at the checkpoint, to be operated twice a day, every single day. He commanded them to feed the civilians, specifying that it shouldn't be a feast, but it must be exactly enough to ensure that no child starved to death on his watch. The major hesitated, stammering a protest about strict Army regulations prohibiting the feeding of non-combatants. Patton's voice dropped to a dangerous, immovably tone. He stated that he knew exactly what the regulations said, and he was officially changing them for this entire sector. He made it incredibly clear that the American Army would feed children. He then turned his intense focus back to Parker and Hayes, both of whom were staring in disbelief. He addressed the lieutenant first, validating his concern for order. He agreed that handing out rations randomly created unacceptable chaos. But then he looked at Corporal Hayes. Patton told the young farm boy that while the lieutenant was right about discipline, Hayes was absolutely right about humanity. Patton outlined the New World Order for Kronberg. They would no longer distribute food randomly based on emotion, but they would also absolutely refuse to let children starve to death. They would establish a proper, organized, and fiercely protected distribution system. Every child would receive something every single day until the international relief organizations finally arrived to take over the burden. He looked at Hayes specifically, his eyes boring into the young man. He told Hayes that his heart was in the correct place, but informed him of a hard truth. A man cannot save the broken world with one single candy bar. Saving lives requires systems, massive organization, and relentless logistics. That, Patton explained, was how an army actually helps people. As Patton turned to walk back to his jeep, he stopped and looked back at the corporal one last time. He informed Hayes that his court-martial was officially canceled. Instead, he was being immediately reassigned. Corporal Jimmy Hayes was now personally in charge of civilian relief for the entire Kronberg sector, with a direct order from General Patton to make sure those kids got fed every day without a single excuse. Hayes stood there, utterly stunned, and saluted. Before Patton's jeep drove off into the dust, the general delivered a final sentence that would echo through history. He reminded his men that they did not fight this horrific war just to become the monsters they were trying to defeat. For the next 3 excruciatingly long weeks, Jimmy Hayes ran the feeding station in Kronberg. Every single morning and every single evening, regardless of torrential rain or freezing wind, Hayes and a dedicated team of military volunteers set up heavy wooden tables in the shattered town square. They hauled out massive cauldrons of hot soup, crates of dense military bread, and gallons of reconstituted milk for the youngest children. The routine quickly became a sacred ritual. The children, realizing the Americans were keeping their promise, stopped pushing and fighting. They lined up with quiet, heartbreaking dignity. The little girl with the pigtails, whose name Hayes learned was Anna, came every single day. She was always near the front of the line, never demanding, just waiting patiently. Hayes learned her tragic history. She lived in a damp cellar with a grandmother who could barely walk. Her father had frozen to death on the Russian front, and her mother had been crushed in an Allied air raid. She was entirely alone in a ruined world. But as the days of consistent food passed, Hayes watched a miracle occur. Anna began to smile. Her hollow cheeks filled out. The color returned to her skin. She was literally coming back to life before his eyes. After 2 weeks of the feeding program, something profound happened. Anna arrived at the morning distribution line carrying a piece of coarse, salvaged paper that had been folded carefully. She walked up to Hayes, thrust the paper into his hands, and immediately ran away, overwhelmed by shyness. Hayes unfolded the paper with dirty hands. It was a drawing, executed with a stub of gray pencil. It was a picture of a towering American soldier handing a piece of bread to a tiny child. The soldier in the drawing was wearing a uniform meticulously detailed with corporal stripes on the sleeve. The child in the drawing had prominent pigtails. Anna did not know his language, and she could not write his name, but she had memorized his face and drawn it with every ounce of skill she possessed. It was a masterpiece of gratitude. Jimmy Hayes kept that drawing for the rest of his natural life. He carried it through the remainder of his military service, brought it safely home across the ocean to Iowa, framed it behind glass, and hung it proudly in his house. Decades later, when his young grandson asked him why a crude child's drawing held a place of honor on his wall over his military medals, Hayes looked at it for a long moment. He told his grandson that the drawing represented the exact day he finally understood what the American Army was actually fighting for. General Patton never mentioned the incident again, viewing it as just another logistical problem solved. But for the soldiers who stood at that checkpoint, it was the defining moment of the war. It was the moment they learned that truly winning a war meant infinitely more than just defeating an enemy on the battlefield. It meant consciously deciding what kind of men they would choose to be when the shooting finally stopped and the world asked for mercy.